I want to welcome you all here to the memorial for our colleague, friend, father, husband, Earl Eldred. More appropriately, I think this is really a celebration of Earl's life. Earl lived life to the absolute fullest. I am Paul Misavich. I am the chair of the Department of Neurobiology. This is the unit that evolved finally from the Department of Anatomy that Earl Eldred joined in 1951. It was a campus that was starting a medical school that didn't have a permanent home to teach gross anatomy in. Much less, saying nothing of research facilities, because there were no research facilities. But Earl and a number of other intrepid scientists decided that this is where they would make their mark. I joined the faculty of the anatomy department, was still the anatomy department, in 1983. And although I probably met Earl in one of my interviews, I really didn't get to know him until we met in the weight room, because all things with Earl started and ended somehow in the weight room. Looking back on that day, I realized that at that time I was 28 and he was 64, the age that I am now. And I still go to the weight room and I still pretend to lift weights. But Earl in those days was, in gym speak, an animal. He would lift heavy weights, he would do circuit training, he would do cardio, he would be running, he was the father of CrossFit, even though at that time no one knew what CrossFit was. But Earl was that kind of guy, and he would always come up to me and ask whether I had maxed out that day on the bench. That was very important for him to know. And unfortunately, there were very few days that I had actually maxed out. And of course, none of us were surprised to hear that Earl started running from his home in the valley to UCLA and then run back. I have enough problems driving that because I live in the valley. I wouldn't run, for God's sakes, into the valley. But Earl used to do that. Another place that our lives intersected was that Earl had a lifelong admiration for Sir Edmund Hillary, who we finally met on a cruise to the Antarctic. And I actually visited the statue of Sir Edmund Hillary on Mount Cook in the Southern Alps in New Zealand. So not quite the same as meeting Sir Edmund, but for me it was still a great moment to see his statue.
Start out with a picture that really says quite a bit about what kind of a teacher Earl was. This was the last day of anatomy class in 1978. You see Tom Sawyer in the middle, and on the right is Carmen Clemente, and on the left is Earl. Was really, in a major sense, the left hand of Tom Sawyer. So Tom Sawyer ran the class. Carmen was the right hand. Before we went into the anatomy lab, we would view for many years early dissection films, and that would set the tone for the laboratory. But Earl really deeply knew gross anatomy dissection and was fantastic in the laboratory, an absolutely great teacher. This is one of my favorite pictures. A little bit out of date, a little bit out of focus. And so I think Earl actually scrawled that up there. And you were told that he had the dubious responsibility for the World Body Program at some point. And I guess he was also, when I was there early on, the graduate advisor. Dare say this is before Paul graced us with his presence, but he was a very practical teacher. He was straightforward. He also had a great sense of humor, playful at times, but always serious when he was teaching, and not getting carried away with esoteric detail like some people get the reputation to when they teach, who are basic sciences, medical students. Okay, so one thing that really stuck with me, and I was searching all over the place, and I finally found it, is I had a really strong memory of Earl got into some Levi's cutoffs and went swimming, and this is Earl at his retirement party doing a handstand off of the diving board. Unfortunately, the medical students won't have an exposure to a great teacher like Earl Eldred was. And I know I miss him still, even as he lives on in my pictures and in our memories. Thanks.
He was born as a single child up in Seattle to great academic parents. His father was a professional musician, and his mother was a housewife. She did have a job once making See's candy. He lived through the Great Depression. He was about 10 years old when that hit, and for a couple of summers, he and his mother actually made a living by picking berries in the fields. Didn't have an easy life of that. But as a result of the Great Depression, it left a lifelong attitude of don't throw anything away. Just save it until it's worn out, and save it beyond when it's worn out, because you just can't throw it away. Later on through school, he joined ROTC near the end of high school, and that helped to fund him through the University of Washington. And then that was in the preview to World War II, and everyone was called into active service in World War II. While he was in the Army, that's where he met my mother, and stated that he was just breathtakingly handsome in his uniform. It was on a blind date when they met, and they've been married some 74 years now. When he returned, military paid for his school at Northwestern in Chicago, and that's where he and Berg married. They'd been dating through this time. There he got his MD and completed his residency, but went directly into research. He never practiced. Barry mentioned Granite, working with Granite. That was one of his early jobs, and he went over to Sweden and lived there with Berg for a couple of years, and that's actually where they adopted Stig. On one particularly memorable occasion, he brought a brain home from UCLA and proceeded to dissect it on our dining table in the kitchen. And in between sessions of dissection, it was stored in the fridge next to our milk and eggs. He had some odd eating habits, including a great love of ketchup, pickle relish, and peanuts. Ketchup he would put on anything, including on the gourmet salmon that his mother-in-law would spend half the day baking. Pickle relish he would also put on almost anything. One day we got him to make eggs and ham for breakfast, and he put pickle relish on it. It was literally green eggs and ham. He's always had a great love of the outdoors, taking Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Sierra Club, group from work on all sorts of long hiking trips and trips up to the beach. And as part of that, he loved climbing mountains, and there's quite a collection of mountains that he's climbed, like Whitney, Rainier, Longs Peak, and Mount Fuji, San Jacinto, San Gorgonio, Mount Baldy, and so on. It's been mentioned that he often ran to UCLA, and often he dragged the whole family on his hikes to UCLA. And just an interesting tidbit, on one of those hikes, we hiked on the 405 freeway as it was being constructed. The things on his bucket list was to go to Antarctica, and he did that after retirement. And on the way, he met Edmund Hillary, and they have pictures of them together, and that was one of his idols through his life. So at any rate, that's a glimpse into his personal life and what he was like outside of the office here. Thank you.
Earl's scientific career started at Northwestern in medical school, and during that period of time, he published his first paper with Ray Snyder. And Ray Snyder was in the anatomy department at at Northwestern. And importantly, also in that department was Horace Tig Magoon. And Magoon, of course, is famous for having done some basic studies during the late 40s and the early 50s on the reticular formation and its role in arousal. And so at that point, somewhere around the turn, I guess about 1950, he became the first chair at UCLA in the anatomy department. And during that period of time, as indicated here, he also offered Earl a job. And so that's what happened. Earl came to UCLA and began his long career at UCLA. During his career, at least in terms of departmental responsibilities, he was acting chair for a couple of years in the late 50s. I know he was a vice chair of the department, and I know at some point he was also in charge of the willed body program. I had no idea, or I had long since forgotten, that he actually worked on blood. That was, to me, was something new. And so Earl and Berg had published 3 papers together, which are listed here. And if you look at this picture, you see Berg sitting next to Earl, and the gentleman to Earl's right is my father-in-law. And I'm quite sure that he was asking Earl, why did it take me so long to finish my dissertation? And I'm pretty sure he was asking him, was he going to get a job? Ragnar Granit, who received the Nobel Prize in 1967, basically for his work on vision. He basically recorded from single cells in the retina and established the 3 afferent pathways for color vision, red, green, blue. Around the time, I'd say about 1950, he changed his orientation, his scientific orientation, and started studying motor control. And one of the most influential papers of his time that he made the switch is what's shown here, supraspinal control of muscle spindles and its significance. And if you notice, the first author in this paper is Earl. So this is the time when these investigators were starting to look at the influence of descending systems, predominantly on the gamma motor neuron, but also on alpha motor neurons, which apply skeletal muscle. And it was a landmark study and paper. Earl has a really distinguished pedigree. Obviously, Granit, he had published 3 or 4 papers with him in the early 50s. And when I showed up for a postdoc in Tucson with Doug Stewart, he pointed out, quote, my pedigree. And obviously through Earl, through Granit, it's a bit self-serving, I agree. Also traced back to Charles Sherrington, who also received the Nobel Prize in 1932. And Sherrington worked on reflexes. And he was one that came up with the concept that a reflex, it is the sort of fundamental basic thing that is integrated by the central nervous system. They're a very fundamental element to motor control. And he was also the one that coined the phrase synapse. He was a proponent of the neuron doctrine, communication between neurons, that there was a synapse. And importantly, he also coined the phrase proprioceptive end organs, which would include muscle spindles. So Earl's trajectory through his scientific career really can be traced through these 3 individuals, or these 2 individuals, excuse me. This was taken at the top of Bishop Pass, slightly under 12,000 feet, and shows Dan and Earl. And if you notice, his last paper, Distribution of Muscle Spindles in a Simply Structured Muscle, Integrated Total Sensory Representation. There's a name on there, Dan Eldred, from JPL, and I think this is probably one of the few times you'll ever see an author from JPL on a spindle paper, but there it is, and that was last paper. So it's really been a privilege to have, spend a little time on Earl's scientific journey, and also backpacking on the John Deere trip. Thank you.
I was adopted, and so I have different genes. And it turned out that my birth father was a musician, and his father was an actor. and that's where I've become. But Danny and Heidi, naturally born later, were all in the sciences. So mom, lab technician, mother, by the way, here, Berg, she was active here in the Faculty Women's Association, and she was the secretary and the treasurer, and from 1986 to 1987, she was the president of the Faculty Women's Club right here. As Earl, as much as he was so much into education, was the first one to say to me, well, you know, maybe college isn't right for you. So, and I've started and stopped since 1971. I went to San Fernando Valley College, which turned into Cal State Northridge, and the last time I was there was in 2004. So I kind of go and I leave, and I go and I leave, and usually to go off on tour again. His dad, as Danny said, was a musician. He was also a builder. His parents broke up when Dad was very young, and so Mom didn't really like musicians. I think they were the scum of the earth. So at any rate, my dad, when he was in college, he went and lived with his dad for a little while and learned the saxophone. And when his mom found out about it, she put an end to that. But at the age of 50, we had Christmas, and there was a present under the tree, and it said from Santa to Earl. And what had happened is Earl went out secretly to Santa Monica, bought himself a classical guitar, and learned how to play it, and opened up this present under the Christmas tree, pulled it out, and played absolutely perfectly a beautiful classical piece on the guitar. And he kept it up for about 2 years, but it didn't have synapses, so it just wasn't going to do it for him. It had catgut, so that was something, but it was not really that close. The other thing is whenever we travel to foreign countries, which we did a lot of, my mom went to Hong Kong and the Philippines. My dad went down to the Amazon to work with one of the other doctors from Northwestern. Danny and I got to go to Japan, got to go to Europe and Russia. But every time we went to a different country, he would learn the language first, at least the basics. And nowadays you have telephones and all this. Well, what my dad had in his car were flashcards. So, and it was either, you know, the English, French, English, or it was a statement and then the facts behind it. It was no male on his side of the family lived past 65 years old. His dad had a heart attack 2 weeks after he turned 65. Most of the men died of diabetes. His grandfather's legs were amputated and all that. So Earl had this driving desire to stay healthy. So he didn't smoke, he didn't drink, and he did work out all the time. And he exercised his brain as much as he did his body. And so 98 years old when he passed away. There's a company here called REI, Recreational Equipment Incorporated. Well, it was started in 1938, and my father, within the first year or so, became a member. And he is membership number 3,266. And today, there are 6.2 million members. So when Danny and I go down and go buy something in REI and we flash out that card, we don't get any discounts, but we get a lot of funny looks. It's kind of fun. We didn't spend money on anything, as Danny said, you know, until it wore out, or it was way past worn out. But the two things that were lovely to spend money on was education, and part of education was travel. So whenever he could, he would get his travel maybe taken care of when he was going to do a symposium or a lecture. And then so he would take that other money, put it towards a couple of us kids. So Heidi, Danny, and I all got to go. Birthdays were simply books and records only. That's all you're allowed to give. So kind of neat. Dad was in research and dedicated his life to UCLA. Mom did everything else, from the cooking to the cleaning to the doing all the taxes, driving us to all of our music lessons, and watching over us as we practiced, because we had to practice a half hour in the morning and a half hour at night, every night. So they were quite a team, and 73 years of marriage, and Mom's still here with us. And Dad, in his last years with Edwin here, who was his caregiver for over 7 years, every day they would go down to Balboa Park and they'd walk around the lake. And it was kind of fun. They got to know Earl really quite well, because until he had his stroke, he was, in fact, all the way through, he was walking. He could walk all the way through, and all these other people would caregivers would be, wheeling him through when they'd be half his age. And any rate, so as a memorial to Father, there's a bench at Lake Balboa that says, in memory of Earl Eldred, he would encourage you to take another lap around the lake. So, any rate, that's our bit from our family and all, and also really, really lovely to have you all here, and thank you so much.
He actually opened his lab and let me move my lab into his lab. And so then we started doing some of those long duration experiments, and they were fantastic. They were more fun than work. But during that period of time, and thinking about how the environment for science now versus the environment for science then, I was really young in the career, and I was trying to learn how to be a scientist, and I thought when I was there looking back on it, it was the most pure science environment that you could imagine. He just loved science. He did science. There was nothing else. You never had any discussions about promotion. You didn't have anything that was competitive within science. You didn't hear anything about whether you were publishing in a journal with high impact factor. Those things were not even on the table. It was just pure science and just learning as much as you can. You hear this all the time, and this kind of is an illustration. We stand on the shoulders of others because all the ideas from Sheraton and on back all the way through, we're always standing on the shoulders of others, and maybe that's why Earl exercised so much, is because so many people were standing on his shoulders. So to do is emphasize the importance and meaningfulness of the work that he was doing at that early stage with spindles. The point is that this basic work was important then and provided the roots of what has happened years later. People are asking now, how do you control movement with combining all of the sensory systems? You're constantly receiving visual information, sound information, proprioceptive information. So how important is proprioception in your daily life and how you control movement? Proprioception, one of the main sensory endings of where we get much of our proprioception, is from these muscle spindles. And there's one hypothesis that in terms of controlling motion, like locomotion, that the input from muscle spindles is perhaps the most important source of proprioceptive information. I think. Now, what's fascinating to me is this was recently reported in Science, the size of a brain of a dinosaur that lived millions of years and many millions ago and weighs 10 tons, and they have a brain the size of a plum. And so how could that animal control movement and live so successfully, mate, eat, defend themselves with the brain, just with the brain that size? So the idea is that much of the neural control is really in the spinal cord and in the periphery. And so why can it be so important? It can be so important because it is sensing where your body is all the time. And so, and the brain really doesn't know what to do if it doesn't know where you are. And the brain is telling, or the peripheral nervous system is telling the brain constantly where you are. Some of this work has advanced to the human subjects, where individuals are being stimulated in a way to take advantage of what the spinal cord and the proprioception can do, and the new technologies that are included, such as the exoskeletons that you see here. This individual is being stimulated with transcutaneous stimulation, which is an idea that was that of Yuri Gerasimov, who's in the back here. And so we've been working on this idea for some time. But again, without the proprioception, you can't do anything. Without the proprioception, the system would be completely flat. Proprioception is pretty important, and it's going to play a big role in the future in rehabilitation. Another factor that so fits in well with Earl is these adaptations are activity dependent. That is, if you just stimulate or give a certain drug, that doesn't do it. You have to exercise. You have to use the nervous system. So that was pretty consistent with what Earl was doing.
Earl was gracious enough to have me in his laboratory in 1975, I think it was, where I was able to go into his lab and work on cats and do some really amazing things. He was gracious to let me in. I learned a lot from him. He was an amazing experimentalist. He was really fantastic at dissection. I learned that from him. I didn't spend a lot of time with him, but I really came to recognize his professionalism and that he was truly a kind person. So I was very grateful. Since Judy and Reggie are here, I have to say something about them. If you talk about standing on people's shoulders. So I grew up in Van Nuys, California. I was not supposed to go to school. I was supposed to go out and get a job. I was fortunate enough to be able to come to UCLA for $109 a quarter in 1971, and it was very important for me that I was able to work with Reggie and Judy in their laboratory, and I have to thank you for everything you did for me, because I would not be here without you. So they stood on Earl's shoulders, and I'm standing on theirs, so thank you very much. Merton and Marsden had these famous papers on muscle wisdom, which was the idea that motor neurons could adjust their firing rates to accommodate what the changes that were taking place in skeletal muscle, and in that way kind of minimize the amount of fatigue in the system. So Earl certainly was trained by some major leaders in the field at the time. The trace that you see here is a trace of the action potentials that are produced by these sensors that are out in the muscle. When you stretch your muscle, these muscle spindle afferents fire in prescribed ways depending on how you stimulate them. And this was a figure that was taken from Earl's paper. Here we are with a diagram that I have for you. Here's a muscle, and out here we see this coiled structure, and this is a spring-like structure. It's a muscle spindle. I tell the students that if you wanted to design a sensor to be able to tell you where your arms, where you're positioned in space, I like to dramatize. I open up a pen and I find the spring and I put it right here and I say, there it is. Just put a spring in your muscle and have the spring be pulled or shortened or lengthened as you move that muscle. Put a protein in there that senses that change and converts the mechanical energy into electrical energy, and away you go. These are not just little sensors that go in the spinal cord and end there and just tell you whether or not you're being perturbed mechanically. They're actually going up to the brain. They're telling you exactly where your body is in space. I like to do with the students again. I like to say, well, how do you think you tie an apron behind your back? The only thing you're using to do that is proprioception, or touch the tips of your fingers behind your head. Not until you get to the target do you get any cutaneous input at all. Everything up to that point is from these sensors. I have to say that there's some very sophisticated sensors that are being put into these exoskeletons that are basically following that format. And with that then, many thanks to Earl for allowing me to come into his laboratory and do my first studies. I was there with Barry Boderman when he was a PhD student. Thank you for the time and the privilege to be here.
That says, in memory of Earl Eldred, he would encourage you to take another lap around the lake.